Thanks very much indeed for that lovely welcome. And I was given a brief. It's lovely to be back in this room today. I know 2 years ago I was here and we were all a bit nervous because we weren't quite sure what was about to happen. And it's lovely to be back here and to have a chance to just take stock a little of what has happened and look at this great new guidance that's come out. And I was given a bit of a brief by Andy and Tara to be upbeat. Those of you who know my work in the public domain or even know some of my poetry will know that I tend towards a lament. So it's been really good to have that as a challenge. So this is my title, We Are Language Rich, Celebrating the Bountiful Sources of Language in Scotland. And that phrase, language rich, comes from a 4-year research project that we've been doing alongside the ESOL learners at Glasgow Clyde College and Lynn Marr, who will be leading a workshop later on this afternoon, looking at what language riches might mean. So let's start off with the provocation that came to us in Scotland from the Integration Forum that was set up under the auspices of the First Minister's call for us to have a refugee task group 2 years ago. And we started that work in the Integration Forum by inviting along someone who'd been resettled as a refugee from the Congo. A Congolese refugee who really challenged us in that forum by saying this to us: you in Scotland are stingy with your languages. You don't speak to us in the street. And that really settled into the work that we were doing and the thinking we were doing, because we could all see the truth of it. You know, on a rainy day like we had on Saturday, where you've got your Gore-Tex hood up and you're under your umbrella and it's blowing inside out, we don't greet each other in the street. It's hard to do that. Or if we do, it's like terrible weather and your head's down again. That idea that in other parts of the world, often because the weather's better, you have the time to stop and greet each other, and that the greetings that are normal across the majority of the world's populations aren't just hi or here's the Wi-Fi code, which is now our traditional greeting in many conference settings, but which are hello, how are you, and how are your family, and how is your mother and your brother, and how are the chickens and the goats, and how are the jobs that you are doing, that you have this engagement in much more vocabulary than you would normally have. So this provocation was important to us in thinking about languages and English in particular, and really focused on the structural dimension of how it is we come to have enough time and energy out with the language classroom to speak and learn and practice and embed languages in our everyday life. So you might not be able to quite see this on the screen that you've got here, but the guide welcoming our learners, Scotland's ESOL strategy, which I think has some really wonderful nuggets of gold in it and great examples of best practice, has this as its anticipation for you, that all Scottish residents for whom English is not a first language have the opportunity to access high-quality English language provision so that they can acquire the language skills to enable them to participate in Scottish life, in the workplace, through further study, within the family, the local community, Scottish society and the economy, that these language skills are central to giving people a democratic voice and supporting them to contribute to the society in which they live. These are wonderful aspirations, and they're impossible without really great ESOL provision and a really wide understanding of what languages mean within society. The picture you can see with a mouthful of pencils is from Ireland and Ireland's ESOL strategy, and the sense that sometimes we just try and push more in without actually giving people space and time to speak. So if you're more of a visual learner, that's there for you. So I think over the last 2 years, what I've experienced, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't, is that we've seen 2 years of rapid, focused and willing expansion of language work. But that has not been without its problems, its difficulties, and its nervousness. I think at policy level, and the new guide is a good example, we've seen many examples of new strategies coming through, and a chance at the moment to, as the New Scots strategy comes to an end, to really rethink what our integration strategies might be in the future. And with language having gone from being a footnote to being pretty much centre stage in that process. We've seen a refocusing on the classroom level work and support, and an acknowledgement that more needs to be done at classroom level. And that's been really welcome for me. I've spent 20 years of saying it's just not enough what we do in our strategies for languages across the UK. And seeing how Scotland's actually stepped up and really focused on that has been really wonderful. So I think there's a renewed energy and focus and imagination around that is helpful to us. But then also at community level, we know that we've had something like a 5-to-1 ratio of people wanting to volunteer in Scotland to support and help refugees. That's amazing. But it's also potentially suffocating, and if they're all like my mum, terrifying. And my mum's a former English teacher, and she knows how to do this well and wants to do it. But she also sometimes, and she'd be the first to admit that, this doesn't necessarily know how to do this with people from different countries, different backgrounds, different experience of life, people with different vulnerabilities to those that she has herself. But what we've seen, I think, is a real expansion of that Befriending initiative and the Shared Lives, Shared Languages initiative that's been led by Emily Bryson through the Scottish Refugee Council has really helped think about what might it mean in communities to be offering spaces, cafes, museum spaces, shopping trips, cultural and arts opportunities where languages are shared and lives are shared, and the language learning and sharing is part and focus of that. I think what's been going on in Scotland is going on in other parts of the world as well. So there's a picture there of me right at the other side of the world. This is in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in a migrant resource centre, the kind of space you'll all know from your own communities, a drop-in centre, a support centre, where the slogan is good language, successful lives, strong communities. We can all feel that we're having to be maybe a bit too resilient at times, and that we do also need a space to just admit that sometimes this is just hard work and tiring, and we're a bit broken in this, and we're not always quite sure what we're doing, and that the provision isn't necessarily all it needs to be. Because there are differences in provision patchily across the UK. We do say differences in what is often offered to a refugee language learner compared to what's offered to ordinary, everyday students learning languages in our schools and colleges who aren't of migrant background. Compared to what I have used as a benchmark many times, elite language learners. If you study to be a diplomat, you have gone to the top universities in this country, and you will be given, before you are placed in another country, nearly 2 years of very focused language learning support, 4 days a week, maybe 3 months intensive boot camp learning. That's what we do to say that these are people who can hold the vulnerabilities of negotiating international policy and strategy. When we compare this to what you know you're given as resourcing in your own contexts, communities, ESOL classrooms, the contrasts are stark. So those gaps between class and provision, I think, are still pointing to woefully inadequate language provision in the UK. When we look at modern language provision in the UK, even in schools, we know that what we give people to learn French or German or Chinese or Portuguese or whatever the languages are we choose, it's just not enough to be able to learn to speak a language well and fluently. And often we're wasting our resources in the classroom or how we use them because we're not able to give enough to people to begin to feel they're making that progress they need to make. So it's not just for ESOL, it's not just in our context of languages for integration purposes, it's across the board for our integration as people learning other languages into other contexts of our work. And we know how many hours roughly we need to get to the point where we can function and live well in another language, and it's around about 10,000. It depends on the language, give or take. Applied linguists have done an awful lot of counting, but we know roughly what we need, and we can map that onto what we offer, and often there's quite a shortfall. I think it's also really interesting the context we're in at the moment. Scotland has passed a number of laws focusing on language. The Gaelic Language Act and recently the BSL Act really mean that we are enshrined in law a multilingual country. And I think we're starting to see what it means to live with those legal requirements and duties on us that actually start to make us more normal on the world stage. We are much more like the majority of countries worldwide, which are also equally multilingual, which means that people feel at home when they come here, when they see Gaelic signage, when they see people signing for BSL, then that legal dimension means that the language landscapes of our country in Scotland are starting to feel much more familiar to people. And I think that's important. I also think that what the Minister was saying about the number of refugees settled in Scotland and the really positive focus on migration means that we're now in a situation that we weren't at the 2001 census, but have been since the 2011 census, where we're language rich. We have a remarkable linguistic resource amongst us, and that our language models are shifting from being based on deficit models to being based on models of plenty. So where we used to talk a lot, and I used to sit in a lot of language fora, where we talked about, oh, their problem, it's English, it's such a barrier, oh, it's a deficit. And we had this negative way of speaking about other people's language without any self-reflection on our own woefully inadequate language skills in other languages and how hard we find it. Not our fault. It's often caused by policies around language learning, but without that self-reflection of we're teaching people in our classrooms who might have 4 or 5 languages themselves, and if we were lucky, we got standard grade French, and maybe we've used it on holiday once or twice, but we're quite diffident and reserved about it. We're now in a context where that's not as permissible, and we're starting to actually be much more acknowledging of the resources and riches and strengths that have come to us based on a model of plenty. And I do think this idea, this complementary idea of language befriending is really helpful to us in a model of what the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur has called linguistic hospitality as being a fundamental element to our societies. Language befriending as a holistic practice and led from Alison Strang's work with the Holistic Integration Service and the Refugee Holistic Integration Service, that holistic practice of saying we need sufficient, good, structured hours in our classrooms, and alongside it, people in public and civic life and in everyday life who are not stingy with their languages and who kind of just get alongside people and say, do you know, that's really interesting what you said. What would you say in your language to describe that? Getting alongside, multilingualizing those interactions of everyday transactions. And my colleagues, Angela Crease and Adrian Blackledge in Birmingham have been looking at this across the 4 most super diverse linguistic wards in the country over the last 4 years. And they have seen that in everyday interactions in libraries and shops and sports centres and dance classes, that people are trans-languaging. Not one language or the other, but in the course of one sentence, there might be 5 languages spoken. And that's the new normal in many interactions, and actually allows there to be a resource in the classroom if we start to trans-language our teaching that's really interesting. And if we look at countries like many of those that I work in across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, then we find that language pedagogy is in everybody as a natural way of being. It's how people are brought up to be. So that when somebody says a word that you don't quite understand in, say, Ghana, in Twi, then somebody might say, in my language, this is what we say. Or in my tradition, we have this proverb. And so that in everyday interactions, people are teaching and learning from each other. And when we say, how on earth do they get to have 6 languages? That's how. Because in our everyday interactions and encounters, within and out with the classroom, everyone's enabling each other to be multilingually rich. So that teaching and learning becomes something that's done everywhere, not so much programs of lifelong learning as learning everywhere that's undertaken in languages. And I think that model from the world and from the world's language learners that's arriving within us is a real resource and is helping enrich what we do. Certainly in some of the work I've been doing, we've been trying to be quite interestingly intentional about this. And so as someone who began her language work as an ESOL practitioner, just like all of you, I've been doing work where I've been putting English last in certain scenarios and situations. So in the arts-based work I've been doing, putting on productions, we've been working in 15 different languages and then in English, and letting people work from the resources they're strong in first, and then doing the translation work after. And it's been a really interesting experience, and discovering that where we normally think we need to be economic, efficient, transparent in our work, and that's what English is for, it's the language of transparency and economy, and it'll help make things quicker. Actually, when we've looked at the research on what happens when we allow a multilingual environment and people to translate from one another in classroom settings, we've discovered it's more efficient, and that people are more vocal, and people's confidence is higher, and their sense of well-being is stronger, and that their sense of being heard and their confidence in that actually enables them to overcome many of the experiences that they struggle to maybe express in another language straight away. And that's led me to really start to use a concept of what I'm calling language humility. That in the ways in which we've lived over, certainly in the West, over the last 50 years, we've very much had monolingual mindsets. Even within the European Union, the national language is what we think of, and it's a monolingual model, even where translation is a regular feature. And actually the multilingual models mean that we need a little humility that we bring to much of our work, and that can go a long way. In some of the work I do with Police Scotland, it's been very much about enabling people to have a go at feeling what it feels like to not be able to communicate easily, to have to use your hands and your feet and be a bit flushed and embarrassed and sweaty because you're scared because you can't speak French or you've not done it for 20 years. And that empathy, that level of humility can get quite a long way to understanding a different vulnerability. It's easy for us to be a little bit patronising, a little bit, oh, these are vulnerable people and we need to do this to them and that to them and the other. And I think we're learning in Scotland to maybe say, actually, this is about models of resilience in language. This is about us learning too, because our vulnerabilities around language are quite acute. And that when we acknowledge that, then there's a lot of learning we can do from one another. So I'm starting now, 2 years on, to look at things like these good practice guides and say, within these then, multilingual policies of trans-languaging, of having a go, of that humility within language, this idea of language plenty amongst us, if we all share that resource and learn how to tap into it, and learn from those places in the world where that's a default, that they can start to become maybe a norm in our policy making, as they already often are in our practice. Because I've rarely seen a classroom where really the target language is all that's spoken, and certainly the research is showing that code switching, that using multiple languages in the classroom really empowers and helps people. And equally within that, we know from the research, and this is really in the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals and much of the work I'm doing at the moment within the UNESCO programme I'm part of, that mother languages first are vital. For the most vulnerable communities, it is the only advantage those communities have over any other advantage of wealth or race or gender or class or education. That advantage of bilingualism or multilingualism is the only advantage, and it's come for free. It's learnt in the households. It comes then and is structured, and if it's put in place and we have robust mother language, all else follows from that. Where we don't do that, we enshrine vulnerabilities. So the bilingual language units, the multilingual policies are absolutely crucial to us. And sometimes that's just about a shifting of our discourse from the deficit to that sense of plenty and resource. Mother language first is to everyone's advantage in society. And then finally, the final concept I'd like to give you comes from my colleague Steve Thorne in the United States of America, an applied linguist, and he uses this lovely phrase, which is rewilding languages. And he's really looked at the way so often we've, a bit like those pencils in the mouth, we just keep adding another policy or another way of teaching or another great technique or idea. And actually he's then been looking at what happens if our languages get out and about more? Bringing in the arts as a way of playing, bringing playfulness in, doing work that is, yes, in the classroom, but also taking classroom work outside. And I think we know from many of the things we've done when we go on field trips with learners, go on holidays with learners, when we take school trips out, all the things that happen in between the classrooms, and what my colleague James Thompson has called the joy in between, those are the bits where so much happens and is learned. That's what Steve Thorne would call rewilding the languages, letting them be a bit freer and able to breathe. So I'm keen on the idea of rewilding the practitioner and just letting us all have a bit of sense to do that breathing, that resting, that changing that can actually take us into a new place. Because if it's good for refugees, if the strategies and policies and ways of learning we're putting in place are good for people we're trying to serve in these ways of welcome and hospitality, it's going to be good for everyone. Much of what we're learning from our integration is really good for other vulnerable areas of society. It's really strengthening of people whose literacy struggles, people who have been deprived in many different areas of life. So the learning we're doing here with ESOL practitioners, I think, is crucial to the well-being of society. So what should we do with our languages? I think we should live in them. We should rewild them, and we should keep them structured. We should love in them and with them, because the greatest motivators for learning and speaking a language well always comes from the people around us who we love, the friendships we build, the people we're in love with, the people who are parts of our families. So don't be stingy, as Bertin said to us, add to the abundance, and that will be good for everyone. Thank you.